All right, welcome everybody. So today we will be wrapping up my review of the Sacred Candor video, which is mostly just discussing supposed issues with moral relativism. In the previous video, I discussed a bunch of my concerns with a lot of the framing issues related to how people discuss relativism, often making it seem like relativism has these implications that it doesn't really have. In a lot of cases, people, I think, are construing relativism in a particular sort of way. So they often frame it in terms of agent relativism versus appraiser relativism. You know, there's all these concerns that people raise about relativism. So this was originally supposed to be a critique of some of the presumptions and the ways that people address the moral argument for God's existence. But most of the focus of this video ended up being, so far, you know, I got about halfway through it, on relativism. So we'll see what else happens in the video. And so I want to get into it now. Hopefully everything is working. We'll do just a quick sound check again, and we will just make sure that everything is sounding good. So let me go ahead and do that. So share screen and get this going. All right. So
of Osama bin Laden
should be sounding good.
and the Muslim
Does that sound okay?
who thought.
All right. And yeah, sorry, there's still, you know, I'm switching to Chrome for this. So I've run into a couple technical issues with getting things done. So hopefully it's okay. Oh, right. So while I'm waiting for people to confirm that sounded good, let me play a few more seconds of it.
Thought that flying our planes
Audio and all that
into
good?
our buildings.
Good. Okay. So I'll just go over the agent and appraiser relativism distinction, just because it's really, really important. And you need to keep that in mind when you see people characterize relativism. Okay, so let's start with what metaethical relativism is. Metaethical relativism is a view about typically, you could consider it as a view about the nature of morality, but it's often framed in terms of a view about the meaning of moral claims. Now, if you're wondering why are we construing views about the nature of morality in terms of claims about language, that is an artifact of the way that 20th century analytic philosophy addressed philosophical issues. A lot of the sorts of metaphysical claims that philosophers wanted to make and that they continue to make within the analytic tradition are predicated on how, like on a sort of a really twisted relationship with language, where language has a certain special relation. Like we use language to pick things out or refer to things. And then, you know, we start with our analysis of what we're doing with the language that sort of fixes for us what the subject matter of a particular discourse is. And then we go and look, okay, well, what is the subject matter doing? What do the sentences mean within this particular subject? And then we figure out what reality is like, somehow on the basis of that. I don't know why we're supposed to make such leaps, and often those leaps are rather mysterious, but in any case, so relativism, a lot of people are familiar with it being framed in the popular discourse in ways that often construe it as this view where you tolerate other people's cultures or you don't impose your values on other people. Well, those are normative moral standards. So that's not really what metaethical relativism is about. And another feature that's commonly associated with it is the simple observation that different people have different values. So you'll see people say, well, relativism's got to be true. Different people have different moral standards. Okay, well, you know, different people, some people are atheists and some people are theists. Does that mean whether God exists is a matter of personal preference? God exists, I would take to be a question about which there's some fact of the matter that does not turn on our preferences or our values or anything like that. So, you know, that's the sort of issue where, you know, people frame things in strange ways. So people, I wanted to get to this distinction between agent and appraiser relativism, but, you know, relativism is this word where in popular discourse, people mix up normative claims about how you should and shouldn't treat other people, with descriptive claims about what people believe to be the case, and metaethical claims about what it is that makes certain kinds of moral claims true. Those are three orthogonal distinctions. If you're a metaethical relativist, it doesn't entail any of the other positions. And yet people mix these up. They talk about these in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes people mix up another notion of relativism or subjectivism, where they think that if a belief is held from a point of view, that makes it relative or subjective. And like there might be a sense in which you could construe relativism or subjectivism in a way where that makes sense. That's just not the type of relativism that metaethical relativism is dealing with. So metaethical relativism is not a claim that you should or shouldn't tolerate other people, or you should or shouldn't impose your values on other people. It is not the observation that different people have different moral beliefs. The mere fact that different people have different moral beliefs doesn't mean that those beliefs are true relative to those people's frameworks. The fact that if it were a fact that moral claims, the truth status of those claims was relative, does not entail and is not constituted by claims like you ought to tolerate other people. It just doesn't follow. Those are just separate things. So set those aside. Now let's look at metaethical relativism. Metaethical relativism starts with this view that moral claims, the truth status is indexed to some standard. So you take some claim like murder is wrong, and you could sort of translate that. Murder is wrong according to, or murder is wrong relative to some standard. Now, what are the typical standards? Usually the standards of individuals or the standards of groups. Often it's cultures. But in principle, it could be some larger group, like relative to humans or something like that. So what that means is that all of those claims contain an implicit indexical element that allows the truth status of the claims to vary according to the standard to which they are relativized. Well, it's a bunch of fancy sounding language, but we're already familiar with indexicals. So if I say, I am Lance, the word I functions as an indexical. When I say I refer to me. When you say I, you refer to yourself. Some words vary in what they refer to depending on who's using them or how they're using them. What they're referring to varies. And usually that is fixed by the context of their usage. The context of me using I am Lance is, the context is like I'm using it, not you. So that word I can refer to different people. So sometimes people make this really goofy objection to relativism, where they'll say relativism is self-defeating or self-contradictory because it allows for a claim both to be true and false at the same time. Now, check it out. The sentence, according to relativists, murder is wrong, that sentence can be true and it can be false. But it's not true and false relative at the same time, relative to the same standard. It's no more contradictory than the fact that the sentence, I am Lance, can be true and it can be false. It's true when I say it, it's false when people who are not Lance say it. That's not a contradiction, because that's just how the word I functions. The word I functions indexically. So that word I, it makes it clear to anyone familiar with the language that there's an indexical element. But when you say murder is wrong, it doesn't have an explicit indexical term or turn of phrase or something in there that lets you know what the person means. This is the problem with take these everyday moral sentences like murder is wrong or being kind is good. They don't make, if there is an indexical element, they don't make it explicit. So sometimes realists will take this to be this like obvious indicator that we use language, like realists, but it could just be implicit. It could just be something that doesn't have to be stated. And we might sometimes speak this way. Imagine that you eat a piece of pizza and it tastes really good, and you say, this is delicious. Are you making a claim about the objective properties of food? No. You could say, okay, you could be doing a couple other things. And I wouldn't take myself to be making a claim that the food is objectively tasty. I would either be reporting my own subjective attitudes or preferences about the pizza. So I'd be making a factual claim. It'd be something like, I find this pizza to be delicious. Now take that statement. Now imagine I do find the pizza delicious, and I take a bite and I say, this is delicious. It's implicit that like I'm saying it. I'm talking about what's delicious to me. It would be a little weird to say, this is delicious according to me. Like, of course that's according to me, or relative to my preferences. Who else's preferences would it be delicious relative to? So the idea that, there's something suspicious about the indexical element not being made explicit, so we should default to presuming realism. Well, we wouldn't do that for food claims. So why would we necessarily do? We shouldn't, we wouldn't. And so, this should be obvious. And yet, philosophers will still, treat moral language as if it's so easy to just tell without doing any empirical work that it's used in this realist-friendly way. And it's just not obvious. It's not obvious. If you really wanted to know how people were using the words, you'd have to go and look at how they were using them in some real context. My point here with the food example isn't to show, we can use language. I gave one example. If I say, this pizza is delicious, I could be making a propositional claim that could be true or false about my preferences. I could be informing you that I find it tasty. But I could also just be making some exclamation. like, yum. Now, typically, if I was saying this pizza is delicious, even if I wanted to inform you that I liked it, that might be accompanied by some exclamatory elements of the language. So one thing to know about when you use propositional language, sometimes people will focus on the semantics of some sentence as if, someone tells you something like, oh, that person stole something, and you go, what they did was terrible. Now, when you say what they did was terrible, are you simply informing the other person, I would like to provide you with information about my moral standards. My moral standards are that I consider it to be wrong to steal? No, you're doing more than just providing information. When people talk to one another, they don't just, I provide you information, you provide me information. We're trying to do things. So we're expressing goals, attitudes, values. We're signaling things about our emotional states. We do other stuff. That is completely consistent with both realism and cognitivist accounts like relativism. There's no issue with that. You can do two things at once with language. So, if you say, what they did was terrible, that could be both a propositional claim about what you think is right or wrong in the realist sense or some type of relativistic sense where it's dependent on your stances. And you could be functioning to express some emotional state or something like that. The non-cognitivist accounts that hold that moral claims are not propositional are not, it's not like one account says they're propositions with no emotions and the other account is there's emotions with no propositions. It's typically rather it's propositions plus there's some emotions implied, or no, it's just the emotions. So those sorts of accounts, or whatever non-propositional content, that's another thing you could be doing when you say this pizza is delicious. You could say, are you trying to make a propositional claim about your preferences? No, it's just a way of, it's like saying yum, so you're not even really trying to say something true. So those are possibilities with food. Now, my point isn't that, hey, we do speak that way about food, therefore we do speak that way about morality. I am not saying that. I'm not asserting that we speak that way about food. What I'm trying to say is you can point to instances like these hypothetical instances that, to me at least, look like the sorts of things people actually would and do say. There's certainly things I have said and that I've seen people say. And it's not obvious to me. That's an understatement, but it's not obvious that those people are speaking like realists about the tastiness of pizza. So if I don't have that reaction about food, why would I have that reaction about morality just by looking at the sentence structure of moral claims? I think the answer is I wouldn't. So if realists want to appeal to my food experiences don't have the realist phenomenology, but the moral ones do. Fair. It could be that the phenomenology is different for them. It's not different for me, but it could be different for them. Anyway, so appraiser and agent relativism. When people critique relativism, and we've already set aside, it's not about the descriptive claims, it's not about the normative claims. It's a claim about this indexicalization of the truth value of moral claims. There is actually a distinction to be made between agent and appraiser relativism. Agent relativism is the view that the moral claims are made true or false by the standards of the person performing the action. If we're talking about cultural agent relativism, it would be the standards of the culture of the agent performing the action. And so the way that would work is that if there's two people, Alex and Sam, Alex thinks it's okay to steal, Sam thinks it's not okay to steal. If Alex goes ahead and steals, it is in fact okay, from anybody's perspective, for Alex to steal because Alex's standards fix what's right or wrong for Alex to do. They don't fix what's right or wrong for anyone else to do. It's just that Alex's standards determine what's good or bad for Alex to do. And if you're observing that from the outside, you would have to say, well, so you see Alex steal and you go, well, does Alex think stealing's okay? And if the answer is yes, you go, oh, well, then it was okay for Alex to steal. From your point of view, you have to think on that view, assuming you want to think consistently with the view. The only way to think consistently with the view would be to say what Alex did is right. That's just what the view is. The view is Alex fixes what's good or bad for Alex to do. That's agent relativism. Appraiser relativism isn't like that. Appraiser relativism says that the action is right or wrong relative to the standards of whoever's evaluating the action. Now, if I perform an action, like if Alex is stealing, and then you say to Alex, hey, is it okay for you to steal? And Alex says, yes, relative to my standards. Well, fine. And often when a person says, what if they say murder is wrong, they're typically going to be indexing it to their own standards. So, of course, the judgment that's being expressed is true or false relative to the speaker's standards because the speaker is indexing their own standards. So appraiser or wrong relative to the standards of whoever is evaluating the action. Now, my point in giving all those examples is that often that will just be the person performing the action. But critically, someone else evaluating their actions is not obliged to consider that person's actions right or wrong, depending on whether that person thinks that their actions are okay. they can judge the person according to their own standards. So the way that that works is this. If Alex thinks it's okay to steal and Alex goes ahead and steals something, then it's permissible relative to Alex's standards to steal. But if you come along, let's say you're Sam, and you come and look at Alex's actions and you don't think murder is okay, well, then you could say, and it would be consistent with your view to say, Alex stealing is wrong relative to my standards. And you could see there that you are not obliged to think that if Alex thinks that stealing is okay, then you have to think it's okay for Alex to think that stealing is okay. Now, why does this matter? Well, when people critique relativism, they often frame it as if agent relativism is the only position on the table. And so if someone else thinks it's okay to, say, steal your wallet, you have to think it's okay for them to steal your wallet, because their attitudes about what it's okay for them to do fixes or determines what it is in fact okay for them to do. So if they think it's okay to steal your wallet and they come up to you and they say, give me your wallet, and you say no, and they say, I don't think you understand. You're a relativist, so you believe that my attitudes fix what's right or wrong for me to do, and I do think it's right for me to steal from you, or at least permissible for me to steal from you. So hand over your wallet. You don't have a legitimate basis for objecting. Now, if you actually held the view that if someone mugging you thinks it's okay to mug you, then it is in fact okay for them to mug you, then it's true. Yeah, then why are you objecting? It is okay for them to mug you. It wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, right? You actually would think, you might think it's good, or at least there's nothing wrong with them mugging you. So why are you objecting? And so people will say, see, relativism has this ridiculous implication. You can't object to what other people do. You can't dislike what other people do. I'll stop sharing for now. Why am I sharing that if I'm not playing it? Because I'm talking about the agent appraiser relativism distinction. Okay, so the point here is just that people will make relativism as a whole metaethical position out to look really stupid by implying that it has this implication that if other people think something's okay, you have to think it's okay for them to do those things. You have to think it's good or whatever. And that's only true of this very distinctive form of relativism, not appraiser relativism. Now, let's bring this back over to the food cases. Now, you could try to apply some agent relativist standard to people eating food, and you might not have big problems with that. So if Alex thinks that pizza is tasty, and Alex says, this pizza is tasty, and Alex means something like, this pizza is tasty according to my standards, you might think, okay, well, that makes it the case that it's in fact good. So when Alex eats pizza, the pizza is good. And I think it's good for Alex to, like, gastronomically good for Alex, to eat that pizza. No big deal, right? It doesn't carry those practical implications because it doesn't have these spillover effects that reflect your conduct. It's not like Alex is making you eat the pizza. But think about if you sort of spread it out to where that you don't make clear whether you are relativizing the claim to your standards or to the speaker standards. So Alex says that pineapple on pizza is good. Now, what Alex means is that Alex finds pineapple on pizza good. Okay, now that's true. If you're an appraiser relativist, you could say it's true relative to Alex's standards that pineapple on pizza is good. And then if you don't like it, you could say, but it's false relative to my standards that pineapple on pizza is good. No problem. Now, if you're an agent relativist, you still get this funny thing that goes on there. Now, if Alex says pineapple on pizza is good, and Alex means that it's good to them or good relative to their standards. Now, you might think it is good, like, for Alex to eat the pizza. Does that mean you have to like, the pineapple on the pizza? Does that mean you have to like pineapple on pizza? That's a little weird. What exactly do you mean? You might have to think, if you're an agent gastronomic relativist, that it is in fact good for Alex to eat the pizza. Or you might think Alex should eat the pineapple on the pizza, right? You might be consistent with the view to think something like that. But it doesn't mean you have to like the pineapple on pizza yourself. You don't have to like eating it. So there's something a little weird about this framing. And when you transpose it over to morality, because morality often concerns like other regarding actions, but gastronomic preferences typically don't, it gives this impression that if you're an agent relativist and someone else thinks, torturing people is good, you yourself think torturing is good. Now, the only thing you'd actually be committed to is something that's still pretty bad, which is it's good for that other person that likes torturing to torture people. You would have to think that's good, even, according to your own standards, because you're not an appraiser relativist. So it's still a little weird, but it's not exactly what critics of relativism make it sound like. They make it sound like, and they do this by conflating, that person's standards and your standards that you yourself enjoy or approve of performing the action yourself. Sometimes they make it clear enough that they're just saying you would have to think it's good for them to do it, even if you wouldn't think it's good for you to do it. Sometimes they'll do that. So sometimes they'll make it, they'll be clear enough to say, yeah, if you're a relativist and someone else thinks it's okay to steal, you have to think it's okay for that person to steal, even if you don't think it's okay for you to steal. And that might be true, again, of agent relativism, but that's not the only kind of relativism. And it's actually a kind of a weird one. So I don't really know why critics do this. I mean, it's really easy to criticize because it's really easy rhetorically to make it sound like if you're a relativist, you're committed to thinking that the bad things people did are good. The things like the rest of us think are bad, but you would be committed to thinking that they're bad unless you want to be inconsistent. And so people will exploit this rhetorically. And again, when I say exploit rhetorically, I don't necessarily mean that they're doing this intentionally or consciously or maliciously or anything like that. But it's pretty easy to say, oh, you're a relativist? Oh, so those people over there that tortured people, you have to think that that's good. It's clearly not good, so your position is awful. That is the typical point leveraged against relativism, and it only works against this one form of relativism, and it's kind of a weird one. It only works against a specific type of agent metaethical relativism. That's it. It just doesn't work against the other type. So why do people do that? Okay, I said a whole bunch of stuff about that. Looking in the chat. Okay, I said I was going to get into the video, and then I spent 20 minutes talking about agent and appraiser relativism. I just think this distinction is so important because, you know what, I took like 2 hours to get through the first 15 minutes of that video, and it's just like that same point over and over and over. Agent and appraiser relativism are not the same thing. So the last thing I'll just say about that is, look, all the appraiser relativist is saying is something really basic and simple that simply doesn't have all these horrific implications that people attribute to relativism. They're saying something like this. Statements about what's right or wrong or good or bad express the first order moral standards of the speaker making the statement. And so long as those statements are consistent, like in fact consistent with the standards of the speaker or their culture, if you're a cultural appraiser relativist, then those statements are true. And they're true in a way that's pretty trivial. And the way I like to frame this is that you could translate the statement or unpack the statement into what it really means when you get rid of all the implicit features. In other words, make all the implicit components of the statements explicit and then reanalyze the sentence and then look at whether you really find it sort of personally objectionable or not. Now, let's go back to Alex, and Alex thinks, and let's pick like something worse than just me saying stealing. Alex thinks it's morally permissible to torture people for fun. Now, the typical way of criticizing the relativist is to say, hey, relativist, Alex thinks it's okay to torture people for fun, so you think it's okay for Alex to torture people for fun. Or they might, if they're being extra sloppy, say, you think it's good to torture people for fun, which is really, it's not clear exactly what that means. Now, if you're an appraiser relativist, that is at best, misleading statement. It might be false, depending on exactly what they mean or how they resolve the ambiguity, but it's at best extremely misleading. It makes it seem like you don't care as much about torturing people for fun. Like if you found out people were torturing people for fun, you'd be like, yeah, well, it's okay for them to do it, or it's good for them to do it, or whatever. And so this makes it look like the relativist is committed to something awful. Now, let's actually unpack on the appraiser relativist what they're actually committed to. Here's what they're actually committed to. When Alex says it's morally permissible to torture people for fun, what that means is, again, this is on the appraiser relativist view. What that means is something like this. According to the standards of Alex, it is okay to torture people for fun. So when Alex says it, Alex is referencing their own standards. So it's like them saying, according to me, or it's consistent with my standards. So be like Alex saying, it is consistent with my standards to torture people for fun. Now, if in fact it is consistent with Alex's standards to torture people for fun, is the statement, it is consistent with Alex's standards to torture people for fun, true? Yes, it's true. Now, what follows from that? So basically, it's just like Alex saying, I think it's okay to torture people. That is basically what it comes down to. And then that would be true. Now, does that mean you think torture is okay? Nope, has nothing to do with that. Does that mean you don't care as much about torture as realists? Nope, doesn't have anything to do with that. Does that mean you can't stop Alex from torturing people for fun? Nope, has no implications for what you can stop or not stop people from doing. Does that mean you are prohibited from interfering or imposing your moral standards on other people? Nope, doesn't have that implication. Does that mean any of this stuff that's supposed to be so bad? No. The statement would be trivial. It just doesn't have any of these awful implications. So And by the way, the Stanford Encyclopedia entry of philosophy on moral relativism actually draws out this distinction between agent and appraiser relativism. These are not proprietary terms I made up. It's right in there. And you know what? Let me just show you. Why say it when I could just show you? Okay, I am going to show you this. Okay, so let's read this passage. That to which truth or justification is relative may be the person making the moral judgments or the persons about whom the judgments are made. These are sometimes called appraiser and agent relativism, respectively. Appraiser relativism suggests that we do or should make moral judgments on the basis of our own standards, while agent relativism implies that relevant standards are those of the person we are judging. Of course, in some cases, these may coincide, as I pointed out. Appraiser relativism is the more common position, and it will usually be assumed in the discussion that follows. Okay, so I don't know where they got the idea that appraiser relativism is the more common position. There's no you'll see that there's no citation there. I don't know if anyone surveyed relativists to find out if appraiser or agent relativism is the more common. But here you have the sort of like, gold standard entry on moral relativism, and it's like, look, here's a distinction between agent and appraiser relativism. I'm just going to assume appraiser relativism. Okay, if that's the case, let's just say that that's a pretty typical view among among people that work on this topic. Appraiser relativism is kind of the default unless you assume otherwise. Okay, so why do all the critics, give me 1 second. Okay, so the question then is, why do critics focus on agent relativism? I think it's because it's low hanging fruit, and I think it's because it's easier to criticize. And I think that's pretty messed up. And I think critics of relativism need to up their game. If they have a problem with appraiser relativism, okay, what's the problem? Now, the way to critique that is to say that's not how people talk. That's not like the correct semantic thesis. That's a lot less rhetorically as powerful of a critique. Okay, so I've said enough about that. Let's get into the video. Oh no, I'm sharing the wrong thing. I was sharing this itself. 1 second. That's funny. 1 moment. I always mess stuff up. All right. Okay, let's play it.
With our innocent loved ones in them was morally right. And some people will say that too. Some relativists will say, well, what about the terrorists? They think that, committing jihad is morally right, that's what their God wants them to do. But how about this? What would happen if we had flown bin Laden's planes into his buildings with his loved ones? Bin Laden would have known that these acts were undeniably wrong. And that is something that when I read that in the book, I was like, whoa, that is so true. Someone like Hitler, someone like Bin Laden, if we were to behave the way they behaved towards them, towards the people that they cared for, towards the people that they love, they would know that it's wrong. The moral law is not always the standard by which we treat others, but it's always merely the standard by which we expect others to treat us. Reason number 3, without the moral law, there would be no human rights. This is getting deep, guys. Imagine if the Declaration of Independence started with, we hold these opinions as our own rather than self-evident or truths. They wouldn't have conveyed any objective moral justification for their Declaration of Independence. It would have been just a mere opinion against that of
That's an interesting point. Like if someone said we hold these opinions to, well, I don't know if they'd say we hold these opinions to be self-evident, but the language there, again, this is an issue of pragmatics and not just semantics. And of course, because I don't even think there is a semantics to these sorts of claims, but there's this connotation. If I say, if I said it's my mere opinion that these should be our laws, that makes it sound like there's something like like what you're saying is in a certain sense contingent, or you don't care about it as much. It carries certain kinds of connotations that are not strictly entailed by the sort of laws you want to lay down technically being subjective. So there's a big difference between saying, hey, look, I don't ultimately think that there are any objective or stance independent moral truths, but I have these moral standards and they're deeply important to me, and I'm going to base my society around them, or make why would it matter if the contents of the bill, like the rules laid out in the bill, were true in a stance independent way? What if you didn't care about the rules? So what if it turned out that the actual rights that were like the stance independently true ones were stuff like you must scream at tables all day? I've given these examples before. In other words, if the normative content of the stance independent moral rules didn't comport with things that we cared about, it's not clear to me that we would comply with them. I'm not asking the question of whether we should or we shouldn't. I'm saying I just don't think that we would. I think we wouldn't care about them. I actually think that there's something very strange about the way that realists frame the moral facts, that the sort of normative content of the moral facts that they think are the moral facts. They happen to comport with what that person's judgments, like at a sort of first order level, are. It's rarely the case that there's this big gap between, I guess you could say, their own values, like their own subjective values, and the moral facts. Now, to be fair, you will see people say there's often a conflict between what's the morally right thing to do and what they, quote unquote, want to do. Often the conflict is one coming down to self-interest versus a more altruistic thing. Well, that's true. And I'm not saying that people's moral standards happen to comport with their self-interest, or they happen to comport with exactly whatever the person sort of like locally wants to do. But I don't think that's how people actually acquire these first order normative moral beliefs in the first place. I think that they largely acquire them via enculturation. Maybe there's some evolutionary stuff going on there, but I largely think people acquire via the way that they're enculturated and the way that they think about these things and their interactions through the course of their life. People are inculcated in a whole range of things by the society around them that prompt them to feel shame or guilt, or to recognize that certain things are regarded as praiseworthy or regarded as shameful, and they themselves take on these attitudinal reactions to these sorts of things. And in other words, people's attitudes about these sorts of things are tuned by the society around them and not merely their self-interest. And so from a first person perspective, there's a sort of chasm between your self-interest, like, oh, I really would want to steal that, or, oh, I really would want to like not report something that would make me have to pay extra money or whatever. And then the thing that you feel is the right thing to do. And I think that gives realists, and I'm just speculating on the phenomenology and psychology of realists, the sense that that extra stuff, that doesn't feel like the self-interested part. And so it feels like it's like you're detecting something out there, and you're not really. You're detecting your conditioned, like internalized attitudes about shame and guilt and your reactions to things in your culture that you picked up. Like that's what it actually is. It's just other emotional states that you have. And I think people just sort of, it's not like when you internalize a sense that, if I did that, I would feel guilty, or if I did that, I would feel bad about it. It's not like when you internalize that, you internalize and recognize and have introspective access to. In other words, when you think, you have access to what the cause is that caused you to feel that way. You don't have access to that. And so what do people do? They make inferences. Now, I infer that the fact that I would feel bad if I stole something is not attributable to me detecting the stance independent fact. Like it would be wrong to steal even if I wanted to. I don't think I'm detecting facts like that. I think I'm detecting something about my own internal psychology. I was brought up in a society where stealing is seen as negative, as bad. You shouldn't do it. and you learn your whole life, don't do that, it's bad, you shouldn't do it, respect other people's property, you shouldn't do it, it's bad, you shouldn't do it, you shouldn't do it, you shouldn't do it. You hear that a lot, you internalize that. You are an organism that evolved with this capacity for, acquiring, acting on, and complying with cooperative norms for living pro-socially with others. And that sense can serve to regulate and motivate you to comply with certain sorts of norms, even if they don't strictly and immediately serve your own rational self-interest. You're, in a certain sense, serving the norm. And that can feel like you're serving something outside of yourself. And to the extent that like the compliance of the norm, it's not compliance with your own sort of direct goals, it can have that, it can really have that sense from the inside that you're complying with these facts out there, but you're not really. I mean, what's actually regulating your actions in those cases is the fact that you want to comply with that sentiment. If you don't want to do it because it would feel bad, or you would feel guilt, or it doesn't feel right, you are responding to internal psychological states. And what I'm saying is that even if you had knowledge of these stance-independent moral facts, I don't think knowledge is sufficient on its own to motivate action. You would have to like care to do something with that information. Otherwise, it's just information. It's inert. That information would have to be mediated by some fact about your own goals and motivations. A goal and motivation to comply with those facts, to avoid the shame or guilt of doing something you think is bad, to feel the sense of pride or accomplishment for doing the thing that's good. Whatever it is, I think it's going to be largely coming down to this reward punishment structure that is associated with the degree to which you are disposed to comply with what you take these standards to be. And so in a certain sense, the only way I think you can, and I mean this, like the only way you can comply with stance-independent moral facts is if they happen to accord with or be a sort of ratcheted into or grafted onto your own subjective, you could say stance-dependent values. In other words, unless you value doing what's stance-independent, unless you sort of stance-dependently value doing what's stance-independently valuable, you won't do what's stance-independently valuable. It has to align with that stance-dependent value. You have to value doing what's stance-dependently valuable. Otherwise, you just won't. And so that, for me, creates this problem that when people frame these issues, you have to pay attention to the connotations associated with saying that's an opinion. Well, okay, but if the only thing you ever do is comply with your subjective values, and some people like me don't care at all what the stance-independent values are, then yeah, I only care about my values. But it's also true, or I should say, I'm only responsive to facts about what my values are. I only make decisions on the basis of what will further my goals and interests and my values. I think that's technically also true of realists. It's just that they happen to value this external body of moral facts. So if that external body of moral facts was something where they heard about it and they go, whoa, I don't want that at all, they're just not going to pick it. They're not going to comply with it. So who cares if that's what it's like? And if it does align with what they already valued, then they don't need it to be stance independent to want to do it in the first place. So, for instance, I care about my family. Now, if you're a realist and you think your family, let's talk about not necessarily morality, but like you think your family is intrinsically valuable or something like that. If you find out they're not, would you just stop caring about them? I wouldn't, because I'm already like that. I don't think my family is intrinsically valuable, and I don't think they're intrinsically more valuable than other people's families. I just value them more. That's a fact about me. And it simply doesn't matter. And I don't care whether they have intrinsic value. That makes no difference. Because if I found out they didn't, it's not like I would go, well, I guess I don't care anymore. You act in accordance with what you care about. And so if you're looking at some set of rights, this Bill of Rights, or this set of, these rights, and they came from some outside source, who cares? Who cares? Why would it matter? Why would you care if God told you these are the moral facts? Who cares? What matters is whether you care about them. That's what I think is actually driving people. And so it can rhetorically sound really nice to say, see, they had to bake it in, this notion that they're self-evident in this realist conception. I don't even know if it's not like the United States is founded on moral realist principles or something like that. I mean, you could try to get that. It's a strained reading. But even if they were like realists or something when they were writing this sort of stuff. What actually matters is what people care about, not whether these values are externalized. Like, just why would that ever matter? Okay.
King George. They were convinced that the founding fathers were convinced that King George's rule needed to end in the American colonies. So they appealed to the creator's moral law because they believed it was the transcendent standard of right and wrong.
Okay, so I guess just the other point is, who cares what they thought? Like, so what if that's like, let's just suppose, yeah, okay, so they thought that moral facts were, based on God's law and were transcendent. Okay, so some people thought something. Why should any of the rest of us care about this? I mean, this is trying to, persuade by saying, hey, these respected historical figures think a certain thing, so you should think that thing, or something. Like, is that the point? Who cares what they thought? So what? A lot of these people had a lot of really stupid and awful beliefs. I don't particularly care what they thought.
Wrong. The founding fathers were convinced that George was violating the rudimentary human rights of the colonists. But if the moral law is not real, if it doesn't exist, then all of that is just a mere opinion. And some people,
Yeah, see, just a mere opinion. See, just a mere opinion. Okay, so you're trying to live a decent life, in some place, and you're being oppressed by a tyrannical king or whatever, and you believe that you have these inalienable human rights that are endowed upon you by your creator, whatever. And so it's really important for you to protect those rights, right? Okay, so you find out there is no God. They didn't endow you with any of these rights, and none of them are inalienable, and there's not transcendent, and they're not self-evident, and they're not intrinsic. So it just doesn't matter if the tyrannical king shows up and taxes you until you have no money, or conscripts your whole family into a war, or just says they're going to burn your house down. Now it doesn't matter. So like none of it's objectively true. So now it doesn't matter to you. Doesn't matter. Is that the reaction you would have? It's not the reaction I would have. That's ridiculous. Why would you stop caring about things if they turned out not to be objective? Like, just again, bring it over to food. So you're eating your pizza, it's tasting delicious, you're enjoying it, you're having a good time. Someone comes over and in the middle of you taking a bite, they convince you that pizza is not intrinsically tasty. It's not tasty independent of how it tastes to you. It's only tasty relative to your preferences. But it's not tasty from like no particular point of view. It's not intrinsically tasty. Would you go, oh, well, there's no point in eating this pizza? Just no point. And in fact, you would just eat garbage or baby diapers. It doesn't matter. You just eat whatever. A box of thumbtacks. Doesn't matter to you. Doesn't matter. Because it's not intrinsically tasty. So you would be indifferent. You see how ridiculous that is for food? Why isn't it any more ridiculous? Why isn't it equally ridiculous for morality? What actually matters is what you care about, not what these objective facts are, or supposedly are.
they will claim that the founding fathers ultimately that they're wrong. And I think we all know that that's pretty much a bunch of BS. I think we all behave that way. And as we showed in reason number 2, moral relativists will behave as if objective right and wrong exist if you treat them objectively wrong. Norman Geisler.
Yeah, as I said in the last video, and I've made pretty clear, relativists don't act as if realism is true. The way that people act, if they're acting, it's going to be on their first order normative moral standards, and relativists and realists can have exactly the same first order normative moral standards. You can't tell from a person like opposing murder whether they're a realist or a relativist. You just can't tell.
Also talks about the Nazis. In Nuremberg, the Nazi war criminals were convicted of violating fundamental human rights as defined by the moral law, which is manifested in international law, by the way. If there were no transcendent international morality above the laws of the secular German government, then the Allied countries in World War II wouldn't have any grounds for condemning the Nazis. No.
You see, there it is. If realism isn't true, you'd have no grounds for condemning bad people for doing bad things. That is simply false. It's not true. I have no problem condemning Nazis or condemning people for doing bad stuff. That is just not a problem. Just not a problem. Well, I'm not technically a relativist, but I could just say relativists have no problem condemning these things. Relativism is a view about the meaning of first order moral claims, that the truth status of those claims is indexed to the standards of the speaker or the culture of the speaker. It has nothing to do with whether they can or can't consistently condemn things. Of course they can. Again, if you're a appraiser relativist, you could say, yep, all that stuff is horrible, awful, bad, repugnant, no good. You're not prohibited from condemning things. Why would you be? You see what I'm talking about? How people will frame. I mean, first of all, if this is an argument for moral realism, showing that relativism is wrong does not show that realism is true. You just show relativism is wrong. Okay, what about error theory? What about non-cognitivism? And if this is supposed to be a critique of, say, agent relativism, does it show that appraiser relativism is wrong? Nope, doesn't show that either. And appraiser relativism simply doesn't have the implication that this person is claiming that a relativist is committed to. So at best, this might be a criticism of agent relativism, but it's nothing to do with appraiser relativism. It's just not true if you're a relativist that you can't condemn things. It's just not true.
No grounds whatsoever. Both the Allied countries and the Nazis were correct. The Nazis did nothing wrong if the moral law doesn't exist.
You see, this person is saying that if you're a relativist, they didn't do anything wrong. That doesn't follow. That is not an implication of relativism. It is not an implication of relativism that you can't think that people did bad things. Relativism, it would hold that whether or not people did good or bad things is true or false relative to your standards. And it could just be part of your standard that they did bad things. I mean, again, compare it to food. Imagine saying if you're a relativist about whether food is good or bad, you think no food is good or bad at all. No food is good or bad. Is that an implication of being a relativist about food? No, it's not. So what's happening is people are conflating whether things are right or wrong in a relative sense with whether they are right or wrong in any sense. And often the underlying presumption is that the only way in which things could meaningfully or genuinely be right or wrong is in the realist sense. So if you don't think they're right or wrong in that sense, you don't really think they're right or wrong. But relativism isn't a view that says, hey, realists are right about what things would need to be to genuinely be good or bad, but nothing's good or bad in that respect. So nothing is in the relativist sense, which is not like a real type of good or bad. Why the hell would a relativist think that? Do you think that when it comes to food isn't really good or bad? I mean, it's good or bad subjectively. Like when I have pineapple on pizza, I think it's good. If you have pineapple on pizza and you don't like it, then it's bad. But it's not really good or bad. I wouldn't say that. Would you say that? Would you think that? Would that be an implication of the view that whether food is good or bad depends on our preferences? No, it's simply not an implication of relativism that you would think that way. It's just not an implication. I know I'm stressing. It's baffling because this is just like definitively not true. And yet you hear this all the time.
But we all know that what they did was wrong. And that's one way that we know that the moral law does exist. The Nazis were absolutely wrong only if we knew what was absolutely right. We do know.
Note that use of the term absolute. So when you say what this person did is absolutely wrong, there's two things going on there. If by absolute, what these people are doing is stands independently wrong. If you're using all the technical language, that doesn't carry that connotative force that if you think it's absolutely wrong, you think it's more wrong or like wrong in the right sort of way than someone who doesn't think it's, quote unquote, absolutely wrong. So this is exploiting the pragmatic features associated with language in the use of that term absolutely. Again, if you're talking only the technical sense, all that's being asserted as a realist is it stands independently wrong. But if you say, only if you're a realist, you think it's absolutely wrong, you're giving the impression that a person that is not a realist, they don't think it stands independently wrong, doesn't think it's absolutely wrong. Notice the tone, the way in which it's expressed gives the impression that if you don't agree, you don't think it's as wrong, or maybe you don't think it's wrong at all if you disagree with the metaethical component. But the tone and the terminology is sort of in a certain way, it's equivocating pragmatically on what's actually being expressed. A technical concept about stance independence, or this tone that is used to convey that you think it's like a really bad, extra bad. Like if you ask a person if something's absolutely wrong, how wrong does that person think that it is out of it on like a 10-point scale? Oh, they think it's a 10 out of 10 bad. But if they just say, yeah, it's wrong. So imagine if I said, what that person did is stance independently wrong. How wrong does it seem like I think that it is on a 10-point scale? Like I said, it all neutral, so maybe a 5 or 6. But if I say it's, it'd be sound a little weird if I'm like, it stands independently wrong. Like that sounds weird, right? It doesn't carry that, because it's not a colloquial term, it's a technical term, it doesn't carry that force. Now, so if you just heard a person say, what that person did is wrong, it sounds like maybe a 5 out of 10 for like how wrong they think it is. But if they said, what that person did is absolutely wrong, how wrong do they think it is? Like, how bad is it? 10 out of 10. And so that the term and the tone is being used to convey the degree of severity. But stance independence is not about degree of severity. So you could think something stance dependently wrong and say it's a 10 out of 10. So like, let's say you're a relativist, you go, what they did is absolutely vile and disgusting and horribly wrong, right? How wrong does that person think it is? 10 out of 10. You say, so you're a realist? And they go, no, I'm a relativist and it's absolutely vile and horribly wrong. So they don't have to use that language to mean stance independent. So you have to be careful with the language here and the tone in which it's expressed, because relativists aren't prohibited from having strong attitudes about things either.
Well, they were wrong, therefore the moral law exists. Reason number 4, without the moral law, we couldn't know justice or injustice. Notice the way those words are, injustice. That means no justice or not just, right? Words like that show that evil is basically the opposite of good. It's the opposite of what's right. You can know only what is evil if you know what is right. Ultimately, we can detect injustice if an unchanging standard of justice is written in our hearts or in our conscience. You can't know evil unless you know what's good. You can't know what's good unless there is an unchanging standard of good outside yourself.
So you can't know what food tastes good or bad unless there's an unchanging standard of intrinsic tastiness outside of yourself. Does it seem reasonable? No, you could just have an anti-realist construal of justice and injustice.
Without that objective standard, any objection to evil is a mere opinion. Norman debated a Jewish atheist who believed that the Holocaust was wrong, no matter the opinion of others, but he admitted that he could only ground it on his own benign moral feeling. The opposition, the Nazis, carried no more weight than his opinion. They're both right. They're both right. That Jewish atheist, he believed the Holocaust was wrong, but he admitted that he can't ground it on anything other than his own benign moral feeling. A feeling, it's just a feeling. But ultimately, if that's just a feeling, his claim that the Holocaust is wrong is contradictory, self-refuting. Because if the way you ground that claim that the Holocaust was wrong, absolutely wrong, if you can only ground it on your own feeling, and that's the only thing you can ground it on, then Hitler could easily say that he grounds his morality and his opinions of the Jews on his own benign moral feeling. And therefore, Hitler did nothing wrong. And you can't say that he did something absolutely wrong.
See, you can't say they did something absolutely wrong. So if by this you mean stance independently wrong, sure, it's inconsistent with relativism to say that what bad people did is stance independently wrong. Okay, but notice this is normative entanglement, to the maximum here. It's giving the impression, if you're a relativist, you in fact cannot and do not condemn bad people doing bad things. And that's just not an implication of relativism. It's not a view about your normative moral standards. And this is giving the impression that it is. And that's a misconstrual of what relativists are committed to.
Because if it's just on your own moral feeling, well, then both of you are right. But then at the same time, both of you can't be right. It's a whole contradictory worldview. If you can't
it's not, so neither appraiser nor agent relativism are contradictory. So if you're an agent relativist and and Alex thinks it's okay to steal and Sam thinks it's not okay to steal, then it's okay for Alex to steal and it's not okay for Sam to steal. There's no contradiction. So like a sentence like it's okay for me to steal would be true when Alex says it and false when Sam says it, whichever. I might have got the names mixed up. But just the point is that those would be indexed, and indexicals allow truth claims to vary in a way that doesn't involve any contradictions at all, because the meaning of the claim varies in accordance with what it's indexed to. So that doesn't follow. Appraiser relativism definitely doesn't have this problem. Just all the claims are relativized to the standards of whoever standard you're relativizing them to. There's no contradiction. They're all indexed. So this idea that moral relativism leads to contradictions, it's just complete nonsense. this isn't even an argument that I think people that are really out to, that really hate relativism among, academic philosophers would make this mistake. Maybe some would anyway, because people really hate relativism, but it's just not self-contradictory. I mean, it's not self-contradictory. I don't know what else there is to say. That's just not true.
Round right and wrong on anything objective. And your claim that Hitler was objectively wrong, it's contradictory. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense at all. You can't make that claim. If you can't ground morality on anything, then you can't even ground it on your own opinion. Because if it's just your own opinion, well, how is your opinion better than Hitler? Why should Hitler follow? To hearing someone say that meal was wonderful and the Holocaust was wonderful, our reaction to that reveals that we believe a mere preference is not the same as true injustice. All of us,
they're not the same. Your like food preferences and your moral standards are not the same. That doesn't imply realism about one and not the other, because one of them is a standard that you may not identify with or care too much about. Like, I like vanilla ice cream more than chocolate ice cream. If I woke up tomorrow and I like chocolate ice cream more, I wouldn't particularly care. I guess if once you're occupying that state of mind, you might not care. But if you told me, hey, tomorrow you're going to wake up and like chocolate more than vanilla, I'd be like, yeah, okay. But if you told me my moral standards are going to change and I'm actually going to like, doing horrible things tomorrow, I would try to prevent that from happening, and I wouldn't want it to happen. So we can have attitudes about what kinds of attitudes we have. And when it comes to food preferences, we might not care that much. When it comes to our moral standards, we have these sort of overarching preferences about what kind of people we want to be. Now, of course, those could change, but that's not really going to make the point here is just that the scope and content and way in which we think about and experience our first order moral standards can and does differ from the way that we think about and experience our food preferences. But those differences are not differences where one stands independent and the other's not, or at least it doesn't have to be.
If somebody says the Holocaust was wonderful, you would not behave the same way, or you would not react the same way to that claim compared to someone saying, man, that restaurant really was wonderful. That meal was wonderful.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, they would be different because you don't think, including if you're a relativist, that someone doing something horrible is wonderful. And if they said it's wonderful, that would be horrible and repugnant and awful. But if someone likes some food you don't like, maybe you go, ugh. But you're not going to be that outraged at the person. Like a person that likes eating food you don't like is not a threat to you. They're not a horrible person to be around. They're not signaling that they're not trustworthy. They're not signaling that they're dangerous. But if you ran into a person that said that they enjoyed like butchering people for fun or something, or they you're not going to want to be around that person for obvious reasons. You don't like their actions. Their actions are horrifying. That person is dangerous. Like, of course, there's differences. It has nothing to do, or at least it doesn't have to do, with realism. An anti-realist, yeah, people expressing food preferences about food I don't like, I don't really care. But people having moral standards I don't like, that matters. If you're an anti-realist, are you just going to not care if someone is like, yeah, stealing is wonderful? No, of course you're going to care. Stealing, you don't want them to steal. So the difference here, the simple difference is that food preferences primarily and for the most part are preferences about your own actions and conduct. They're preferences about what you put in your mouth. They're not preferences about what other people put in their mouths. But moral standards are typically preferences not simply about what you do, but about what everybody does. That's not a metaethical difference. That's a normative difference. It's a difference in scope. It's a difference in who the standard applies to. The food standards apply to yourself. The moral standards apply to everybody. But them applying to everybody is consistent with anti-realism. I can have a preference about how everybody acts. In principle, you could say, I want everyone to eat chocolate ice cream and not vanilla ice cream. Like you could, that'd be weird, but you could think that. And then if you did, and you ran into someone that was eating vanilla ice cream instead when they had chocolate available, you might feel yourself outraged. So it's really about who does the standard apply to? And you can have standards about how other people act. That's not a problem. A moral relativist can say this. They could say, it's wrong for anyone to steal. And then you say, okay, well, what do you mean? That sounds like a universal claim. You must be realistic. They could say, no. Relative to my standards, it is wrong for anyone to steal, or I prefer that nobody steal, or it is inconsistent with my standards for anyone to steal. For you. I consider it bad for you to steal. There's no contradiction. There's no problem. There's no challenge. There's no difficulty. Relativists simply can have attitudes about how other people act, and they are not obliged to care about what those people think about their own conduct. If there's some person that wants to do horrible things and you think what they're doing is horrible and they think what they're doing is actually wonderful, you are not obliged to think that what they're doing is wonderful any more than if someone else likes to eat garbage, you have to think garbage is tasty. You're just not obliged to think that. And it's just so weird people think relativism could get taken out this easily. It really can't.
You just wouldn't behave the same way. You wouldn't react the same way. You wouldn't think the same way about that. And that's how we know, deep down, all of us. It's unlivable, guys. We know that a mere preference is not the same as true injustice. The moral law is not always agreed on, but it's always discovered. And that's the key word right there, discovered, because it precedes us and it's above us. So if you can ground morality just on your opinion, guess what? When you think of how long Earth has been here, you were basically just born yesterday. And if you ground morality on your own moral feelings, well, you can't be the standard. What about everybody who came before you? That's the thing. You cannot be the standard, and nobody will claim to be the standard ultimately, because it's ridiculous. And if you're not the standard, well, then what is? And that's why we say the key word is that the moral law is discovered, because it's been here before we got here. That sounds a lot like God, huh? It precedes us. Without injustice, evil, without an unchanging standard of good, objective good. The moral law exists because we all know objective evil exists. The biblical God, by the way, he is not a created God. He was there in the beginning, was always there, and he's never going to die. He's never going to end. There is no beginning, there is no end to the biblical God. And that is why people say, well, if God is the standard of morality and he's the one that gave us a moral law in our conscience, isn't morality then also arbitrary to whatever God thinks is good or wrong? But here's the thing. If God has always been there, and we're talking about the biblical God here, so let's talk about it in this way. If God has never been created, has always been there, and he never changes, well, then there is nothing arbitrary of an unchanging standard of an unchanging God. There's nothing arbitrary. It's unchanging. And I'm going to say it again. There is no objective evil without an unchanging standard of good.
Oh no, I got muted. Okay, no big deal. Yeah, there's no big deal there. What was I saying? I'm even trying to remember what I'm saying. So many people saying I'm muted. It's nice to see that you're all paying attention, because I feel like we're not getting anywhere with this video. Okay, so what I was saying is that it might be the case that this particular remark being made, there's some way in which you can construe this as being true. And the way that would work is simply that if by arbitrary it's contingent, it's not necessary, then you could say, yeah, God's standards are necessary, human standards are not necessary. And so, sometimes people will say, divine command theory or grounding morality in God, that's arbitrary, or it's just another form of relativism or something like that. And then arguing that it's a type of anti-realism. If the moral facts are made true by God's standards or preferences or stance or whatever, then technically it would be a type of anti-realism. But I do think that if the content of the normative moral standards that are put forward by God are necessary, but they weren't for humans, that is a big, practical difference. Like, God's moral standards couldn't have been otherwise, but human moral standards could be otherwise. And someone could at least point to that difference and say, in that respect, God's standards aren't arbitrary and human standards are. And that might be true. But, even if that's one move you can make to defend against one possible way of raising a concern about one possible theistic form of theistic metaethical position. Okay, so maybe that objection doesn't work. It's not going to rescue theism. It's not going to rescue theistic conceptions of realism. It's not going to rescue realism more generally, and it's not going to substantially undermine relativistic positions. So, this might be a 1 point on the dialectical scoreboard for theism and the moral argument in a very narrow and constrained context, but it doesn't really push the dialectic forward in any substantive way.
Objective good. The moral law exists because we all know objective evil exists. Reason number 5, without the moral law, there would be no way to measure moral differences. The moral law is an unchanging moral standard beyond all humans that we use to measure people's morality, like Mother Teresa and Hitler, which is what Norman Geisler talks about in the chapter. When we evaluate their behavior, we compare their actions to a standard beyond them. So in the book, Norman Geisler gives an example of how this works. So if you want to compare Mother Teresa's morality to Hitler's morality, you want to compare their morals, and you want to say that Mother Teresa was morally better, she was morally right, and Hitler was morally wrong, what you're ultimately doing is you're comparing both of their actions to an objective standard above or beyond them. And the example that Norman gives is, think of a map of Scotland. So say you have map A, map B. You have 2 different maps or 3 different maps. But let's stick to map A, map B. There's 2 maps, and you want to know which map is the closest or which map is better. The only way you know which map is better, you have to compare both maps to the real, unchanging Scotland. If you know what Scotland looks like, if you know the objective, real Scotland, then you have the standard by which you can judge a map that is supposed to look like Scotland, so that you can know if it's a good map, if you could use that map to maneuver around Scotland. The only way you know which one is better, if map A is better, is to have an idea of the real Scotland. But here's
Yeah, I mean, the point here that's being made is a little strange. So what's the idea here? That if you're not a realist, then you wouldn't have any way of measuring your, like, which actions are like more or less right or wrong or something like that? Why? Like, what if you subjectively hold the view that it's morally good to maximize utility, and so you favor anything that would increase happiness and decrease suffering? Okay, so provided those are measurable, then you can measure what you consider to be right or wrong. There's nothing about subjective or non-realist standards prevents you from being able to measure things relative to those standards. That's just not an issue. So I don't think that there's a substantive objection here.
Here's the thing about that example is the key here is that if Scotland doesn't exist, well, then both maps are meaningless. Because what are you comparing those maps to? How do you know if map A is better than map B if Scotland doesn't exist? In the same way, when you say stuff like murder is evil, you shouldn't abuse children, or don't torture babies for fun, those claims have no objective meaning. If Scotland doesn't exist, a map for...
Whoa. They have no objective meaning? If what? If you're a relativist or an anti-realist, they would have an objective meaning. They're just not stance independently true. It stance independently, like that they have a meaning would be stance independently true. So like, okay, if you're a relativist and you think murder is wrong, and when you say murder is wrong, you mean that murder is inconsistent with your moral standards and you don't want people to murder, it is a fact that you don't want, like a stance independent fact, you don't want people to murder, that you disapprove of murder. And that if you say, hey, the reason I disapprove of murder is because it causes suffering or whatever, like you appeal to a higher, like a more abstract normative moral principle that you also endorse, again, on subjective grounds, all that could be true. It's like stance independently true that it tends to cause suffering. So there's a whole bunch of stance independent facts for an anti-real, or potentially at least for, or at least they're not relativistic in the way that the standards are made true by preferences. So it's not that like that a murder causes suffering is true because you prefer that it's true. So you're at least not going to view these sorts of facts in the same way you view what makes the first order moral claims true. So nothing about relativism commits you to not thinking anything is objective or anything is stance independently true. There's going to be a whole bunch of stuff that's even sort of your moral framework, that there's going to be all these descriptive facts that are stance independently true.
For Scotland is meaningless. If morality doesn't exist, then any moral claim that you make is meaningless. If you're liking this video so far,
yeah, see, if if morality doesn't exist, a relativist doesn't think morality doesn't exist.
Subscribe and you like this video. Words like good, bad, better, and worse.
Did he really say again that it doesn't exist? Let me go back just to be sure that I heard.
Those claims have no objective meaning. If Scotland doesn't exist, a map for Scotland is meaningless. If morality doesn't exist, in any moral claim,
relativists don't think morality doesn't exist.
Claim that you make is meaningless. If you're liking this video so far, make sure that you subscribe and you like this video. Words like good, bad, better, and worse are also meaningless in moral statements without the moral law. Moral relativism means that there are no moral differences between justice and injustice, freedom, slavery, equality and racism, care and abuse, love.
See, there's no. Hear that again. Maybe it's just late and I'm tired.
Meaningless in moral statements without the moral law. Moral relativism means that there are no moral differences between justice and injustice.
No, it doesn't. Relativism is not the view that there's no difference between. Again, compare to food. You're a relativist about food, right? Whether like a statement like this pizza is delicious is true or false depends on the preferences of the person making the statement. So a person that likes pizza, they say this pizza is delicious, is true. The person dislikes the pizza, they say the pizza is delicious, it's false. They're like lying or confused or something. That's relativism. Now, if you're relativist, does that mean? I mean, let's go look at exactly what's being said here.
Statements without the moral law. Moral relativism means that there are no moral differences between justice and injustice.
Okay,
freedom,
so if
slavery, equality, and
if you're relativist about food, does that mean there's no differences in the food that you eat? There's no differences. So I could serve you pizza with mushrooms, pizza with cockroaches. No difference. There's no difference between which one's good or bad. Is that what relativism commits you to? No, it does not commit you to the view that there's no differences between things. I don't know where he's getting this from.
Racism, care and abuse, love and hate, or life and murder. We all know that's absurd. Therefore, the moral law exists, and relativism is false.
Okay, even that's absurd. Therefore, the moral law exists. This is a non sequitur. Even if relativism was absurd, it wouldn't mean that the moral law exists. Like, so if relativism is false, therefore a moral law, and like keep in mind his earlier remarks that the moral law has to come from God. So relativism is false, so God exists and issues the moral law. That doesn't follow.
We all know that's absurd. Therefore, moral relativism is false, and an objective moral law exists. Reason number 6: without the moral law, you wouldn't know what's right or wrong. If you know what's wrong, you must know what's right. But if there is no right, or if there's no moral law, then there is no right or wrong. As a matter of fact, you wouldn't. 2 + 2 = 4, you know 5 is the wrong answer. That's the only way you can know what the right answer to 2 + 2 is. That's the only way you can know that 5 is the wrong answer. You can't know 5 is the wrong answer if you don't know 4 is the right answer. To claim that something is wrong is to claim that something is right. That's basically the key here. Relativists deny the moral.
Yeah, this is really weird because it's like, okay, sometimes people will say you couldn't know that something's hot unless you know it's cold. You couldn't know pain unless or like happiness unless you know pain. If you're going to say that you can't understand one end of a spectrum without understanding the other end of a spectrum, and there's some point where it like shifts from positive to negative valence or something, okay, but I don't know what that has to do with relativism. Like that one end of the valence spectrum can only be understood if you have access to or understand the other end. What does that have to do with relativism? I don't know what the point is here. This doesn't even seem related.
Law in one sentence, but they assume it in the next. Reason number 7, so that one was shorter. Reason number 7, there are no moral grounds for political and social dissent at all. If morality doesn't exist, then what are you fighting for in political and social discussions? That's actually...
You could fight to achieve your goals and values. What's the issue? The political dissent. So again, like think of the tyrant king. So the tyrant king wants to like burn down your house and steal all your stuff. So if you're not a realist, there's just no reason to object. What if you don't want them to do it? That's not a reason to object?
The funny part with a lot of relativists as well is that all of them have political opinions and they have...
Okay, I just got to say, I want to get this video wrapped up, and then I'll talk to all of you, because this is, I feel like there's not enough punch in these
political
arguments.
Causes, and they're in some sort of activism, and they're on Twitter or X now talking about this is wrong, this is right, and this is how it should be, this is how it shouldn't be. And ultimately, these relativists, they cannot live their own worldview. It's so
Who
funny.
are all these relativists?
Relativists deny the moral law in one sentence and then assume it in the next. Many political...
Hey, I deny the moral law. There's no respect in which I assume it.
Atheists, liberals are morally opposed to laws that are anti-sodomy, anti-abortion, tax cuts, or anything that the religious right, quote unquote, religious right, might sentence and then assume it in the next. Many political atheists, liberals are morally opposed to laws that are anti-sodomy, anti-abortion, tax cuts, or anything that the religious right, quote unquote, religious right, might support. But if there is no moral law, there's nothing objectively wrong. If there is no moral law, then no political and moral position is objectively right or wrong, even for atheists. What are you doing? What are you doing? Talking about this law.
Yeah. Okay. So if none of so your views on the issues, you don't think they're objectively wrong or objectively right or whatever. And what are the implications? Why that doesn't have any implications for whether you would have any reason to be involved in political or moral activism or something like that.
Law is bad, that law is good, and this is how things should be politically, and then you're in some sort of activism. What are you doing? I thought morality doesn't exist. Without the moral law, there's nothing.
See, again, with the morality doesn't exist. Being a relativist does. Jesus. Look, he got me. I'm implicitly assuming Christianity's true. Oh no. Like, just Jesus. It's not the view that morality doesn't exist. What the hell is this? If you're okay, for fuck's sake, I am not a realist about gastronomy. I don't think there's objective facts about whether pineapple on pizza is good. Does that mean I think pizza doesn't exist? No. Does it mean I think that there's no such thing as culinary arts, that no food is good or bad? No, it doesn't have that implication. Thinking relativism doesn't mean not exist. It means relative. Exists in a relative way. Jesus. God.
Thing objectively wrong with imposing our religious beliefs on atheism or on atheists. There's nothing wrong, as Norman says in the book. He's like, there's nothing wrong with outlawing atheism and creating a theocracy. There would be nothing wrong with gay bashing, racism, or imperialistic wars. Without the moral law, the political...
There's nothing wrong. Again, a relativist does think things are wrong. They're wrong relative to their values. It's not the view that morality doesn't exist. It's not the view that nothing is wrong. That's not relativism.
Positions of atheists and relativists are meaningless. Because if there is no moral law and morality is just my preference versus your preference, well, then there is no such thing as gay bashing. There is no such...
That doesn't follow. That doesn't follow. Okay, so there's no such... What? What? So the action doesn't occur if you're a relativist about morality? Okay, so if you're a relativist about food, then there's no such thing as baking. No one bakes food. No one cooks food. There's no such thing as sauteing. Doesn't exist. Because whether the food that you end up sauteing is good or bad, if it depends on your preferences, then there's no such thing as sauteing. Does that? I mean, look, see how ridiculous that is. I'm sorry, this is ridiculous. It's just a misunderstanding of relativism, and it's really frustrating to listen to.
The right to an abortion, the right to.
I got to stress, I'm not a relativist, but the misrepresentations of relativism are so ubiquitous. It's actually getting to me at this point. Oh.
Life, the right to justice that exists, and every activist is ultimately acting on something completely meaningless. If God exists, his moral law exists, and we have an objective standard of morality to judge from. No one is morally obligated to agree with mere preferences or allow atheists to legislate them on the rest of us. So why?
Yeah, like no one's like obligated in accordance with stance-independent rules to agree with someone's preferences. So,
hey, why legislate laws? Why, if you're...
Because you want to. It's a very simple reason. Why do I want there to be laws against people stealing and murdering? Because I don't like them. I think they're bad. Now, if you say, oh, so you're saying you don't like, just like you don't like, chocolate ice cream? No. Yeah, I mean, yeah, I have an attitude about both, but my attitude against stealing is a lot stronger than my attitude about chocolate ice cream. I mean, if someone said, look, you can have chocolate ice cream, but we're going to have to legalize stealing, or do you want it the other way around? No more chocolate ice cream, but stealing. Yeah, I'll go with the stealing is illegal. Come on now. Just because two things are both things you like doesn't mean you like them in the same way or to the same degree. So people will try to draw this false equivalence that if you compare two things in one respect, they're both things that are downstream of my attitudes or based on my attitudes. So you think they're equally important? No. Okay. I care about my family. I also care about having comfortable shoes. Does that mean I am just as concerned about my family as I am about how comfortable my shoes are? No. So people will do this really goofy thing where they will give the impression that if you compare two things in one respect, you're comparing them in some other set of respects, and then they'll criticize you for the implied comparison in those other respects when you didn't make that comparison. It's really bizarre.
Moral relativist. Why? Don't waste your breath. Just don't do anything. Don't go out there. Don't march. Don't riot. Don't tweet about this is right, this is wrong. Why are you on any political side as a relativist? It's meaningless. If what you...
Yeah, all this assertion of meaningless. So yeah, your personal attitudes, meaningless. Your preferences for things, meaningless. I mean, go read some existentialism or something. People will have this view that without value and meaning and purpose coming from the outside, then there's no value or purpose or meaning at all. I mean, I guess it's just thousands of years of drilling into people's heads that value has to come. I only think that it can come from internal sources. I think it can only come from internal sources. So, my view of morality, like I think the realist conceptions of morality are, for non-naturalists, like literally nonsensical. And naturalist accounts are just like trivial, but I don't really care about those very much. But, this framing that they think morality is real and we don't. No, I believe in stuff that does exist, and you could call that morality, and it's the stuff that's always existed, that is constituted by, okay, let me back up here because I'm being a little sloppy with how I'm characterizing this. Okay, so people engage in moral judgment. People have moral attitudes. We have institutions and laws and values and preferences, and we have, declarations of human rights, and we're morally concerned when we're activists, and we favor these, we donate to charities. All of this stuff is constituted by and is an expression of our attitudes, our preferences, our values, our concerns. To the extent that stuff falls within the scope of like moral phenomena, and I don't see any reason not to say that it does, boom, there's your morality. Morality is something people do, something people feel, something people think. It's real. Now that's the actual stuff. That's the stuff that's real. So I think morality is real. In that respect, I'm not an anti-realist. I'm not against morality being real. Anti-realism is simply a technical term in an academic literature that means that you don't think that there are stance-independent moral facts. That's all it is. It's not a view where you think morality isn't real. I think morality is real. In fact, the stuff that I think is real, I think that's the stuff we should be focusing on, and that my construal of what's really going on there is accurate. I think that there are a bunch of interesting descriptive facts, and we could talk about those. I think that the thing that realist is real isn't real. So, in that respect, then I think what they think isn't real, and then what I think is real. So which of us is the realist? Maybe it's me. Maybe I should say I'm the moral realist. And I've toyed around with this, and it's been a bit tongue in cheek, but I could say, here's another way you could frame the debate, because I think that the naturalist positions are trivial, and we could set those aside and frame it in terms of non-naturalists versus anti-realists, and the naturalists, we could call them something else, moral descriptivists, you could say. In fact, we could just lump them in. Okay, so they think moral facts are a certain kind of descriptive fact, and it's like it's a stance-independent moral fact or whatever. Okay, so they think some of them will try to bake the normativity in, maybe, but to the extent that you're dealing with naturalists that just think moral facts are a type of descriptive fact, okay, so do I. I just don't think that they're like, I don't think moral facts are like supervene on some other set of facts. Like, there's differences between the views, but I think there's just descriptive facts, and I'm perfectly happy to call some of them moral. Does that make me a naturalist? Okay, then I'm a realist, because I think that there's morals. I think there are certain types of facts in the world, and you could call those facts moral facts. So there's facts about what people's moral standards are. There's facts about how people use moral language. There are, if you stipulate that by a moral fact you mean a fact that promotes cooperation within like human social groups, then there's facts of that kind. So, provided you're clear about your terms, of course there can be moral facts. Again, I'm an anti-realist. I think there could be moral facts, and they could even be stance independently true, because getting stance independent moral facts comes very cheap. Okay, by the term moral fact, I just mean a fact about what promotes cooperation. Are there facts about what promotes cooperation? Again, on my view, yeah, there are. Okay, boom. Then you got stance independent moral facts. Not so difficult, is it? So I have a problem with views like that, because I think that they trivialize what these stance independent moral facts are. That's why I say all forms of moral realism are trivial, false, or unintelligible. I don't say they're all false. So if you want to say, if you used words this particular way, then you would be committed to saying realism is true, I'm actually technically fine with that. Not an issue. So set aside those positions that I'm like, they're not asserting anything that I don't already that I'm not already willing to agree with. Set aside those positions, the non-naturalist positions. I think that they have something that's either conceptually really bizarre or metaphysically can be spooky. That's not my main objection. I'm not appealing to Mackey's arguments. But the point there is just that whatever they're talking about seems weird, almost quasi-magical to me. So I could frame it as this. I think that morality just is the stuff that it really exists, like the sociocultural and psychological phenomena. And they think morality is this like metaphysically strange stuff, or this conceptually really suspicious stuff. So for me, I could call that, like, in a certain sense, it's almost magical. So we could frame it as, I'm a moral actualist. I think morality actually exists. And they think morality is magical, which of course magic doesn't exist. So they believe in something that doesn't exist. We could frame it in a really tendentious and unfair partisan way like that. No one's going to bite. Like, it's a silly way of framing things, but you could frame it that way. And it wouldn't be a fair way of framing things. I wouldn't favor framing things that way. I'm not going to call realists moral magicalists or something like that. It makes the position sound silly, and that's a little unfair. But I also think it's unfair to call my position anti-realism. It sounds negative. It sounds ugh, and I think people don't like it. And I think some people, morality isn't real, whatever that's supposed to mean. And it's just not true that I don't think morality is real. It's just not true. So it's real frustrating. Okay.
Believe it's just a mere preference. On morality, no one is obligated to obey a preference, let alone yours. So what are you doing?
Yeah, it's true you're not obligated to obey other people's preferences, in my view. Whether you I certainly don't think your stance independently obligated.
Why aren't you living out your worldview? You see, moral relativists use moral relativism so that they don't have to believe in God, but ultimately they don't want to believe in relativism. They don't behave.
Yeah, psychologizing. They believe in it. Wait, what exactly did he say?
On morality, no one is obligated to obey a preference, let alone yours. So what are you doing? Why aren't you living out your worldview? You see, moral relativists use moral relativism so that they don't have to believe in God, but
they use relativism so they don't have to believe in God. It's psychologizing relativists. So you're using it so you don't have to believe in God. Why would they be trying to avoid believing? Why do you think this? What's the argument for this? Just another assertion. And it's really frustrating when people make assertions like, hey, these people that disagree with me, they only disagree with me because they don't want to accept the truth, which is my view. I mean, you can say that, but why say that? It's not presenting arguments for why the view is wrong. It's psychologizing people. In as far as I could tell, maybe he'll present a bunch of compelling evidence the rest of the video. You want to take bets? You want to take bets on whether we're going to see some evidence?
Ultimately, they don't want to believe in relativism. They don't behave as if moral relativism is true. Maybe in their rhetoric and the way they speak and what they say stuff like, I can't know right and wrong. There is no right and wrong. Everything's just a mere.
Why would a relativist say that there is no right and wrong? That's not what relativism is a position about. That's not an entailment of. It's like maybe some type of nihilism.
Your preference. But then they're going to say, but I believe that is absolutely wrong. And when you ask them to.
But do they say that? And by that, do they mean in a non-relativistic sense? Now, if someone says, I'm a moral relativist and some things are non-relatively wrong. Okay, I'm with you on criticizing them if they actually say that. I don't think they're saying that. I doubt it.
Provide any.
And also, if they are, who are these people? Look, I'm actually critiquing an actual person saying stuff. Here's a person saying stuff I disagree with. I'm responding to it. So if this person wants to make views criticizing moral anti-realists, go and criticize my videos. Why don't you review one of my videos? Find stuff I'm saying and criticize that. I'd love it. Go ahead and do that. I encourage you.
Grounds for that. They'll just say, well, it's just my opinion. But then they're going to contradict what they say in their lifestyle.
Who are these people contradicting themselves? Present examples. And yeah, let's say that you found some. Okay, so some of them contradict themselves. So if I find a few Christian apologists that contradict themselves, I guess Christianity is not true. Of course, that's not an implication. So finding some people that have goofy, inconsistent views doesn't undermine meta-ethical relativism as a position.
Completely. So ultimately, I see relativism as relativists just trying to ditch the existence of God, but without having to suffer the consequences of their worldview because they don't live by it. Without the moral law, you can't be for or against anything. But since we all know that issues about life and liberty involve absolute moral rights, the moral law exists. Reason number 8. If there were no moral law, then we wouldn't make excuses for violating it. Now, this is what I was referring to earlier. And this is what Norman Geisler was talking about when he mentioned, I forgot the guy's name. I forgot his name. Let me look up the pronunciation again. Buzhevsky. There we go. So this is what Norman Geisler was talking about when he was referencing Buzhevsky's book, What We Can't Not Know. So making excuses for your behavior is a tacit.
I wish that blinking light, and I'm being serious about this. I'm not trying to be too critical because, of course, my setup is horrible. That light is blinking way too fast. People in the chat, I'm assuming you agree, right? It's too fast. It's too much blinking. I like background lighting like that, but fix your lighting, please. Everything else, the setup seems nice.
Admission that the moral law exists. If your behavior is not absolutely wrong, you don't need to justify it. Now, here's one thing that relativists and everyone in the world values as a moral value and a moral obligation. And that word is tolerance. that word. You hear it a lot today. Tolerance is a moral principle that reveals the moral law and is the number one virtue our immoral culture demands from everyone. And that is also what relativists demand from you. They will look at you in the eyes, tell you that moral relativism is the truth, the absolute truth, which is funny, right? Moral relativists believe that there are no absolute values, but they're absolutely sure that they're right. And they expect you.
Now, there is an equivocation there. Absolutely sure. You could say there are no absolute moral facts, and I'm absolutely sure of that. That I don't see a problem with that, because what matters is what you mean by absolute in the two senses. And if you're using the two terms in a different way, like you yourself are I wouldn't say equivocating, because you're not trying to use them in the same in like rapid succession, and you're not necessarily contradicting yourself. That's not a problem. So by absolutely sure, you could say, you could mean I'm very sure. You could say I'm really confident that there are no objective moral truths, or something like that. Or you could even say I'm really confident that there's no objective truths at all. Like you could be confident relative to your epistemic standards, something like that. And absolutely doesn't have to mean stands independently, or it just, you don't have to use those terms to mean the same thing. So we have to be careful with whether terms are being used in a way that has some fixed and rigid meaning that's consistent across usages, and whether we're using it in a technical sense or a colloquial sense.
To feel obligated to tolerate them. They're expecting you to tolerate their opinion on relativism and to not force them.
And yeah, remember what I said at the start of this, about conflating metaethical relativism with normative relativism, which is this view that you should tolerate other people, and descriptive relativism, which is this view that different people have different moral beliefs. Those, one's a normative claim, one's a descriptive claim, one's a metaethical claim, like metaethical relativism. These are different claims. There might be this sort of like folk relativist, like the relativist on the street corner, and maybe they have all these tangled up views about tolerance and like descriptive claims and metaethical claims, and they're just a big confused jumble. But why object to non-specialists, like random people that have confused views where their normative and their metaethical views are all kind of mixed up? Okay, maybe they are, but like, why not raise an objection? And you could criticize those people, that's fine, I guess, but I would like to see objections to like well-developed anti-realist positions.
To believe anything else, because if you tried, their reaction to that would reveal that they believe in the moral obligation tolerance. However, if tolerance exists, if just one moral obligation exists, the moral law exists. Here's another interesting thing about that. Begging for tolerance means that the action that should be tolerated is wrong, because you don't need to put up with good behavior. You don't need to convince people to tolerate Mother Teresa's good behavior, only the behavior of some relativists. Oddly enough, the only thing you need to tolerate is the behavior of relativists, because, well, they want to behave relatively to their own opinion, their own benign moral feeling, but you have to just tolerate that. But like I said, if you have to tolerate them, well, then there is a moral obligation right there that you just snuck in for yourself. Like I said, moral relativists cannot live their own lifestyle.
Well, a moral relativist could just hold the attitude that everybody should tolerate one another relative to their own moral standard. That's not a conflict.
I mean, they cannot live out their own beliefs. It's impossible. We wouldn't justify our acts against the moral law if it didn't exist. That's very telling. When you try to justify something that you do, you're doing it because you think it's wrong, because you know deep down that it's wrong. And this is something about Hitler. And I believe it was Bajazevsky. I think that's his name. I forgot already. Again, I think he's the one that talked about this, that Hitler had to dehumanize the Jews in order to justify killing them, murdering them. Why do you have to do that? Why do cannibals have to assume that other people from other tribes are not human? Why? Well, maybe because if they were human, it would be wrong. And maybe
do they in fact assume that? Or do they just think, yeah, they're humans and I think it's okay for me to eat them? I don't know. It's that like everybody that does horrible things to other people, can they only do it if they think they're not people? I very much doubt it. I suspect in a lot of cases they'll go, yeah, I think they're people, and then they don't like those people, and they totally think they're people. They just think they're people they don't care about. I suspect humans are psychologically capable of that, and in fact do think that way, at least part of the time. I don't know.
And so they have to somehow come up with the idea that they're not human, and therefore cannibals can eat those non-human beings. And then they wouldn't necessarily be cannibals in that sense, right? But they're cannibals, and they know it. So they have to dehumanize people who are clearly human. So if that's wrong, then something is right. If being a cannibal, if murdering Jews is wrong, and you have to justify it because you know what is right, which is the right to live for the Jews, the right to live for the people and the other tribes that cannibals are trying to eat. If they have the right to live, then that
We're almost at
moral
the end.
law exists. Therefore, an entire moral law exists. But every law has a lawgiver. Therefore, God, the moral lawgiver, exists. It's undeniable. You can't escape it. If a moral law exists, you have a moral lawgiver. There is no other way. There is no other way. To believe that a law is here just because it exploded into being without a lawgiver, that's absurd. And everyone knows it. And that is why
Exploded
a
into
lot of
being.
skeptics try and prove that relativism is true. Because if morality is relative, then morality doesn't exist. If morality doesn't exist, you don't need a moral lawgiver.
If morality is relative, then morality doesn't exist.
Because there is no moral law. But
I should have just said that's not true, and then that could have been this whole video, 3-minute video.
every relativist cannot live that out. They can't.
See, I'm
They
still
never
giving
will.
myself. It took me 3
They never
minutes
will.
just to say
And even
that.
if they try, they're
Not
going to have
true.
to justify their actions in some way or another. Therefore, the moral law exists, and it's undeniable. Morality comes from God.
Okay.
The unchanging standard of God, because God is unchanging, not created, eternal. That is what it is. This is part 1 of a 4-part series. Stay tuned for episode 2. As a matter of fact, it might be up here or over here, depending on when you are watching.
Okay, so Sacred Candor, that's the name of the channel, right? I would love to talk to you about metaethics. I think that you didn't do a great job representing moral relativism in this video, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with you about it. I don't need to have a debate. Not really an exciting thing to do. I don't really enjoy debates very much. I'm willing to do them if necessary, but yeah, okay. So we got through that. That was kind of rough. I'm kind of tired, so I don't feel like I was at my best for much of that, but I just felt like I had to finish it up. So this is not going to go down in the history books as one of my better streams, but it's something. All right. So I do want to do more review content like this. Hopefully I could do either shorter videos or maybe videos with professional philosophers. So yeah, so people in the chat, what kinds of, you could submit, you could email me videos. Here's put my email right here. I was hoping Danny would show up. I saw Danny on TikTok earlier arguing with religion as usual. I was hoping Danny would swing by the channel. I really want to get over on TikTok and start doing stuff on there so I could just bring people up and talk to them. So if you have videos you want me to review, send them to me. Maybe I'll even do like a community post and ask people to post stuff. Well, it's not going to let them post links, is it? Because YouTube doesn't like links. But yeah, you could email me them. I have a big list of realist videos. So there's plenty for me to have a look at. And I have a whole bunch bookmarked. So if I go and look, let's see if we got some good ones. Because I think that the Trent Horn and Destiny one was really good. Oh, and I did the inspiring philosophy ones. Let's see what we get if we look real quick. There's a lot of videos on the topic. Yeah, a lot of this stuff is just videos of me. Maybe I could review a T-Jump video. What do you think? I haven't had a conversation with T-Jump, so I think, did we speak briefly once, maybe? But like no actual like video. So maybe that's something I'll have to do at some point. I mean, if T-Jump wants to talk, but I could just review his views on morality, maybe. I'm looking through here and I'm just seeing a bunch of junk. I'd have to go through all the bookmarks that I've got. I could also review podcasts. So I saw Digital Gnosis doing that last week. Like I popped in and he was just streaming a podcast and then commenting on that. So it doesn't have to be another YouTube video. So I could do that. So yeah, just let me know what kind of stuff it would be cool for me to review. Also, it doesn't have to be metaethics. I could do other stuff. I don't know if anyone saw Kane B's last AMA, but it's pretty funny because he's like, I hate doing this and I'm not going to do it anymore. So there might be no more AMAs. And I've never done an AMA. And I could tell you why. Here's why. So if you look at Kane B's channel, and by the way, if you're not subscribed to Kane B, you really should be. Because if you like my stuff, Kane B just produces better content. So Kane B has a whole series on metaethics where it's just stuff covering the metaethics literature. I do this thing where I'll take like 3 hours to say 4 things 8 times. So, I'm kind of hanging out here and I'm taking a long time to get comfortable with the streaming. That's part of the reason I'm doing it more now, because I was away for so long. I want to get more, I see people streaming and they're more chill when they're streaming. So you might see I'm trying to be a little more laid back when I do this, but where was I going with that? I lost my train of thought. See, I'm tired. What's my train of thought? What was I making a point about? I don't even remember. What was I talking about? That's ridiculous. I can't remember what I was talking about. Well, whatever. I'll just pivot to something. So if there's videos you want me to review, send them over to me. I'll have a look. I'd like to review more content. Have a look at what other people say about other stuff. I just finished up today a really long blog piece, and instead of splitting it up into a bunch of parts, I'm just going to just post the whole thing. And this time for that, I wrote this like summary of it that's like 5 bullet points, and it's maybe 1 page. So hopefully that will make the blog more accessible. I have seen people do cool stuff with Substack. So on Substack, you can record audio, and then there'll be like an audio version at the top of the blog. So I don't know if people here read the blog very much, but if I start recording an audio version, like I just read the blog posts, sometimes, it's the kind of stuff that's not written for an audio script. So it sounds a little weird when you read it. It can be awkward and stuff, but I'd like to do that. It would make the content more accessible. Spotify or something like that. I just like to get that stuff out there, because I do think that I put my thoughts together better on the blog, but there's just so many more things. Oh, right. I think I was talking about sending me other content. Oh, I was talking about the KNB stuff. There we go. I got it back in my brain. So yeah, KNB did this AMA and was like, I hate doing this. I'm not going to do it anymore. And I would be concerned about doing an AMA, because KNB, if you go, and I think I was saying, yeah, that KNB is a great channel. There's good metaethics content on there, but KNB also does like a whole bunch of other content. He's more of a generalist, and I'm just not. I just don't cover a bunch of different topics. Now I'm expanding the range of topics, but I don't have the love for all of philosophy that KNB seems to have. So if I did an AMA, I might get a bunch of questions. I wouldn't have anything interesting to say about them. So what's your view on ontic structural realism or something? I don't know. I don't have a view on it. I don't have anything to say about it. So I am worried about an AMA, but I'd consider it if people would be interested in me doing that. Like, as long as you're okay with me filtering questions and answering like a quarter of them, if that's all I want to do, then maybe I'll post a video asking people to do that. So that's a possibility. But I also just really want to find more things to do. Like, I have done the one-on-one conversations, like the one with David Enoch, but I'd like to do like a panel discussion, like 2 versus 2. I'm happy hosting debates if other people want to come onto my channel. There's a variety of people I'd like to have on the channel, where I'd like to get people to debate with each other, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of other, this could be a very mixed and open-ended format where we get to do what we want here. And I'd like your feedback on that. Someone says, my rage is the best bit. Yeah. So Patrick here says, Lance, don't worry about being chill. Your rage is the best bit. Yeah, I get grumpy about this stuff. It bothers me because I see it's so constant. I feel like, I have to repeat myself because other people keep saying the same things over and over. And I'd like people to say new things that are critical of anti-realism. So, if people, it'd be good for me to debate or to have discussions with, send me an email about that, or post a comment on this video saying, hey, you should talk to this person or that person. That's how the David Enoch discussion got set up. Someone thought it would be good for me to talk to him, and they said, if I arrange it, would you talk to him? And I said, sure. And they did. And then that worked. They put us in touch. I would say, I wouldn't want you to just like send an email like with me and some other person in it and say, here, talk to each other. But if you have a suggestion, then we could discuss that. If you think that there's people I should talk to. A lot of people want me to talk to Mike Humer. Mike Humer's like maybe the biggest name in moral realism. So that's a little, I feel like that's maybe I should be a little more seasoned before we have that discussion. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if we had a discussion now. And Humer is generous with his time and makes a lot of appearances on a lot of channels and is very laid back with the discussion. So I don't think it would be super intense, but I don't know what my hesitancy about that is. So Nitty says, I'm late, start over. So yeah, I'm not doing that. I have started over a few times because of just like weird technical stuff with using Chrome, but it seems to be working fine. All right. Oh, and I posted a TikTok today. And then the person very graciously had several responses. So that was nice. So yeah, I am on TikTok, and let me just read this post and then I'll get back to that. So Justin says, Lance Independent, I honestly don't think most apologists are able to get past the one big thing. There has to be right and wrong. If anything about morality is up to humans, they just don't get it. Yeah, I mean, there could be attitudes people have about what's right or wrong, and there's a God, and that God says, "Hey, this is what I want you to do." This could be true at the same time. So, I've never seen the problem with theism and anti-realism. Why can't you just be both? You could say, "Yeah, I'm a theist, and I don't think there's stance-independent moral effects." I think that this idea of stance-independent moral effects is so bizarre. It's just, I think it's a weird idea, and I don't know why a lot of Christian apologists think you just got to have moral realism. And from some of those discussions, I'm not even sure that their conception of realism is anything like the conception of like secular moral realist in analytic philosophy. It looks very different. Like the stuff about laws is really weird. Laws have to have lawgivers. That's just not how secular moral realists think about this stuff, like at all. All right. What else? Okay, what was I saying before? Oh, right. So on TikTok, you could do like a live video, kind of like this, but it's really easy to like bring people on stage and talk to them. You could do one-on-one, you could do group convos, and you could then stream that content back onto YouTube. So that's what Danny from Phil Talk does. So if you're into people arguing about religion, then go check that out. It's going to be as popular, but you'll often have quite a lot of people watching those lives. It seems to be pretty bustling over there. Like there's a lot of activity. I don't know how much there'll be for metaethics, but I go into other people's lives. Maybe some of those are recorded and you'll see those on here, but I haven't recorded any of those. But it's might just be a much more efficient way for me to have a different dynamic and style of interacting with people, and that'd be fun. Okay, so I can't think of a whole lot else. There's other stuff I could review, but I don't think I'm up for it. So, and I'm not seeing questions or anything from the audience. Any of you got any more comments, questions, anything to add? If not, then maybe it's time for me to head out. I'll give you all a minute. I'll go grab a drink or something. Be right back. Oh, wow. I'm back and a lot of you are still around. All right. Let's see. I see a few extra comments. Okay, let's see. Pierce says, I think it's just rhetorically powerful, especially when people haven't been socialized into the relevant philosophical linguistic context. It's easy to confuse people with language. Yeah, it's easy to confuse people with language. And yeah, so check out Cainby's like last AMA, because there's a cool question about his views on like Wittgenstein and ordinary language philosophy. And when he started answering, I thought I was going to be upset, like, I hate that stuff. But what he went on to do is to characterize a lot of the objections that ordinary language philosophers have about how a lot of philosophical issues appear to be pseudo problems rooted in misunderstandings about language. And then, characterizes like the way that ordinary language philosophers approach these things, which is that, this is what people mean in the ordinary context or whatever. And then those are empirical questions. Why didn't they gather empirical data? And they're just doing philosophy the same way analytic philosophers had been doing it, like from the armchair. And that's kind of my vibe too. Like, they raise good objections, but then their solution isn't any good on my view. So it's unfortunate, but it took until the beginning of the 21st century, of just like a couple of years before I started college, before experimental philosophy stepped onto the scene. And it's, there was this period, where it was like this exciting new thing. And there were these blogs and websites, and I went to pre-conferences on experimental philosophy back almost 10 years ago now. Oh my God. Wow. It's a long time ago. But I don't see that anymore. I mean, you'll occasionally see X-Fi conferences, but it seems like the buzz died down. Doesn't mean it's not going on, but it seems to have sort of been reabsorbed by the academy into something that's no longer seen as so revolutionary. Now, that doesn't mean good work isn't being done. If anything, I think that the current generation of people working on this are doing work that, unsurprisingly, they're building on and learning from the mistakes of the previous 20 years. And so the work being done now is if anything, better. But I wish it had that momentum going for it, that push in its favor. A lot of people have never heard of experimental philosophy. So that's kind of a bummer. So Pierre went on to say, I mean, that's why apologists might be so attracted to the sorts of rhetoric that the person in the video you're being reviewing is relied on. Yeah, they really do rely, because the video, the person, in the video, they rely so much on like the same type of objections that I've pointed out, implication heavy and rhetorically heavy, and that's kind of a bummer. I wish that wasn't the case, but it's actually surprisingly popular among philosophers to say these sorts of things. There's a podcast I am tempted to play in another review where I'll show you. Maybe I'll identify some clips so I could skip ahead, because for this video it was just like, I'll just listen to the whole thing. But this one I would like to show some timestamp stuff, because I think that the podcast is over an hour. I'm not willing to sit down and listen to that. But there's a particular point in it where they make some claims, and they're professional philosophers. And I just found the claims not just subject to philosophical objections. I found the claims like really objectionable, what they were saying. So that would be a fun one to play, so I could show you what I'm talking about. But yeah, definitely I'd like to see debates would be cool to review, and commentary from elsewhere. So Rainbow Beat says, do you have a theory about what truth is, and what part of philosophy is that concerned with? Like a theory about what truth is. I don't like framing things in those terms, because for me, a lot of that, like that sort of question is like, there is this particular thing and we need to figure out what it is. And I feel in a lot of these cases, there's this, a lot of philosophers seem to have convinced people that words have these distinct meanings, and they pick out these specific phenomena, and we got to figure out what the phenomena is by studying how we use the words. And I don't approach things that way from the outset. So like, I don't think there's like a correct account of truth or meaning, but there is an account that I lean towards or favor. And this is a more recent development for me, which is a pragmatic view of truth. Uh-oh, I heard something funny out there. Give me 1 second. It's my dog. Okay, I don't know what they're doing, but it sounds like they're having fun. So we'll just leave them at it. But yeah, so I'm a pragmatist about truth. And, this is something where I've been working my way through William James. And it looks like I have more of an affinity for more classical pragmatists like James and Schiller. And there's others I'm going to have to look into. But I'm newly on that path of looking into that. So the big things for me is, I spent years and years and years working on metaethics, psychology, metaethics, and the dissertation where I really dug into that research. I got into like measurement stuff in psychology. It's a year out of that. And while I still have a lot of that stuff to work on sort of getting that work out there, my interests have started to sort of Like I feel like the self-imposed narrowness of my interests has started to recede. And what's going on there? What are you doing? We got a second dog, and I think they might be playing. 1 second, just to make sure everything's okay. I think it's okay. They're just having fun. That's good. Yeah. So I'll just give you the short answer. Pragmatism. Check out pragmatism. So Nidhi says this: young people are given the moral argument during presentations I like to call apologetics fire hose. Most don't have formal or even lay philosophical education. Ooh, with the Turk babble. Yeah, and I think a lot of this stuff is coming from that style of, I guess I want to say, kind of like showy apologetics, which I'm not a fan of. I mean, is that a surprise? I'm not even a Christian. Why would I be a fan of that? But I think Christians shouldn't be happy with the kind of shallow, philosophically soft, and often poorly, it's not even engaged with the framing and the way it's not like they engage with the relevant literature and they do a bad job of it. They literally don't even seem to engage with it, and it's pretty bad. And I wouldn't want my views to be defended by or expounded upon by people that, I don't want the proponents of my view to not take rival views seriously and to not engage with the scholarship on that stuff and to not really think through things carefully. Now, does that mean I think that the only people that could be advocates of a view have to be like academics and be all super elite, sophisticated? Not at all. I'm not into that. You don't have to be super knowledgeable to just be clearer and to not misrepresent stuff or act like you're representing a literature that you don't understand or concepts that you don't understand. And I think a lot of that is really unfortunate. And it's quite common among a lot of Christian apologists, which, to be fair, it's common among activists and proponents for a lot of groups and organizations of perspectives and worldviews. So it's not like it's distinctive to them, but that's just a group I see a lot. Okay. I like that someone says Schiller is extra sassy. Most people don't know who Schiller is, but Schiller is just the quintessential sassy philosopher. And that's one of the things I like so much about Schiller. I think I was getting to this and then I forgot because it's like stream of thought and I don't know what happens to my brain at night, but letters between James and Schiller, and Schiller had always James had always cautioned Schiller, like, tone it down. You're being too aggressive and opposed to your critics. Now, I should say, you might be thinking, what am I talking about? So James and Schiller, they would get pretty frustrated with people constantly misrepresenting pragmatism. And many of Schiller's objections to much of what philosophers were doing back, over 100 years ago are pretty similar to the sorts of objections that I raise now and that people with similar views to me raise against philosophers, like the weird manipulation and exploitation of logic to try to do things it can't really do, and just all the weird things that philosophers tend to emphasize in the way they go about doing it, basically that they rely on bad methods. So Schiller made a lot of similar points and would make them in a way that was sassy. Like, people didn't like it. It was abrasive and irritating to other people and very critical. And, there's almost, it's pretty difficult to express, hey, it's not that I think you're wrong. It's that what I think you're doing is fundamentally wrong. A lot of people don't take kindly to that suggestion, no matter how nicely you suggest it. And the problem is that when you make those kind of suggestions, a lot of times people don't want to hear it. And they might not like you, and they might not like your views, and they might not like what you have to say. And, Schiller would get pretty caustic with people, and James would say, hey, reel it in, like, chill out. But in that exchange of letters, and a friend of mine who went through and read these letters for their own research pulled out some excerpts to me and showed them to me and showed me how, like, James eventually came around to say, I think you might be right. Like, these people are just dedicated to pissing us off. And, maybe I should be more sassy myself. So I think it's interesting. You've had this sort of a dissident group of philosophers that have been around like the whole time. There's people that sort of pick at the mainstream, and the people in the mainstream views tend to not treat them very kindly. And I don't know how to navigate or manage that. I want to get along with people. I don't want to have unpleasant fights. I'm still reeling from having some of them, even a few months ago. And I don't know, maybe that's not a good thing. Maybe I need to get over it and be more willing to fight, for my views. But Sapir, I don't know what that scientific realism comment is about. So maybe we're going to have a discussion so I have more context about it. Okay. I'm supposed to be talking to a digital nose like Nathan tomorrow about consciousness. So I don't know if that's going to happen. We'll see. I'll have to check. So you may see me streaming tomorrow. So there'll be a lot this week. What else? Let me check my blog. I should have some stuff coming up. Yeah. I mean, it might be just related to what I'm going to talk about there. But yeah, I guess that's it for now. All right, everybody. So, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed, all that stuff, help me get the stuff out there. But the big thing I really want to do is hit 1,000 followers on TikTok, because that could really change up the dynamic of what I do and how I do it. I'd like to do that. And we got a few people scheduled, 2 or 3 people that I've either scheduled things with or am discussing with to talk about various topics. So you'll see stuff coming out in the next couple months. There'll be more coming too. All right. Take care, everybody. Good night.